Today we continue our Foundations of Jewish Philosophy series. We are trying to cover famous essays, famous pieces, famous articles and treatises of Jewish philosophy. And today I picked arguably the most important essay ever written on the subject of the afterlife. This comes from Rambam's commentary to Mishnah, Maimonides, Rambam with an M, his commentary to Mishnah that he wrote as a young person in the final chapter of the book of Sanhedrin. The Mishnah is 63 books. One of the books is called Sanhedrin, and the final chapter, it's a very famous chapter because it talks about all the things that happened after you die, the afterlife, and the resurrection, all those exciting, esoteric, eschatological subjects. That's what's addressed in that chapter. And the Rambam, as he sometimes does, he gives a sprawling introduction to this very exciting and intriguing and compelling subject. Now, the introduction itself is very, very famous because this is where Rambam codifies his 13 principles of faith. As you recall, we spent a lot of time going through these 13 principles that undergird our religion. We went through one at a time. Where does the Rambam codify this? Where is it written? It's written in the next part, in the second part of this introduction. So there's like two parts of this introduction to this chapter of Mishnah. And the first part we'll start. We won't be able to finish today, but we'll start today. And the second part we already did, which is the 13 principles of faith. Now, this Mishnah that he's commenting on, it starts off, Kol Yisrael, all of Israel, Yeshlem Chelek. They have a portion in the world to come. In fact, the name of this chapter is called Chelek, which means a portion. All of Israel has a portion in the world to come. This is where our sages talk to us about the afterlife and about reward and punishment. And the essay that we're going to cover today is the exploration of this subject of reward and punishment. Now, it's a very long essay, and what we'll cover today are all the introductions of the introduction, meaning he's going to have to set the ground rules for the discussion of the topic of the afterlife by first dispelling a lot of confusion and clearing the path for the discussion that he wants to have. And he begins by saying, people who are students of the Torah, they have so many different opinions about reward and punishment. Everyone agrees that the Almighty will reward those who adhere to His word, will punish those that reject His word. But what exactly is that good, that reward for mitzvos, for mitzvah observance, for living the life that is articulated in the Torah? And what exactly is the punishment for disobedience? There's lots of opinions. And everyone has their own different opinion, and there's so much confusion and so much disagreement, rank uncertainty about this most important question. And people's positions are complicated and confused and unclear, and there's basically no one, says the Rambam, who has this subject out clearly. And no one is even certain. Everyone has just this big jumble, a big mix of confusion. And basically what he's going to say is like, we're going to organize this. This is why it's such a famous piece, because he's going to organize the question, reward for mitzvos, punishment for transgressions. But again, there's going to be introductions, multiple layers of introduction till he gets to his point. And the first introduction is, well, what do people actually believe? He says there's lots of different opinions. Some people say, the first class of people, the first cohort, they say that, well, reward is Gan Eden, paradise. And what's paradise? It's a place where they eat and drink without having to work hard and without toil. And there's houses in paradise built of diamond and precious stones and very comfortable beds made out of silk. And there's rivers that are flowing with wine. And there's lots of fat and robustness. That's the reward. Sounds pretty enticing. And the punishment, well, that's purgatory. That's Gehenna. And what's that? That's burning with fire. that they burn the bodies and people suffer in all sorts of terrible, painful ways. And the stories of the suffering in Gehenna are very long. This is the first group of people, the first cohort. This is what they believe. And then they say, we'll prove it to you. And they bring citations from our sages and from verses that the simple interpretation of those verses seem to indicate that they're correct. Cohort number 1. And then there's a second cohort. And they argue and they think that the reward, the ultimate reward, is the days of Mashiach. May he be revealed speedily. And in those days, all people will be like angels, and they'll live forever, and their stature will be held high, and they'll grow and proliferate and be very strong. And they'll exist, all of the world will exist for all of eternity. And this Messiah, in the eyes of this cohort, he'll live with the help of God forever, never die. And in those days, the earth itself will instead of producing the raw materials, like fully formed clothing and baked bread will come out of the ground. And all these things which are impossible based upon what we know about the laws of physics, all those rules are discarded. That's the reward. And the punishment is that a person who violates the Torah won't be present and won't merit to see those days to witness this Messiah. And this second cohort, they bring proofs as well to their position from the words of the sages and from verses that if you read the verses very simply, it seems to indicate that they are correct, or at least partially correct. That's the second cohort. And then there's the third cohort. And they talk about resurrection. After people die, they will come back alive, and they will be alive with their relatives and their family members, and they'll eat and they'll drink, and they won't die. And that's the ultimate reward for mitzvos. And the ultimate punishment is that someone won't come back alive after they die. That's what the third cohort believes. And they too bring proofs from many, many sources that seem to indicate that if you read them simply, it seems like at least partially this is correct. And then there's the fourth cohort. What the Rambam's doing, he's laying out the different opinions that people say and all the confusion that arises from this question of reward and punishment. The fourth cohort, they say that the ultimate reward for doing mitzvos is physical pleasure and material abundance. All of our lusts in this physical world, the fatness of the land and lots of property, and lots of children, and physical robust health and peace and security. And we'll have a Jewish king who will rule over all. And we'll see our enemies reduced and humbled. That's the reward. That's the ultimate reward, this fourth cohort says. And the ultimate punishment is the opposite. And there'll be more suffering in this physical world. And this fourth cohort, they too find sources that if you read them simply, it seems like they're correct. And then there's the fifth cohort, and they just do a big mashup. They jumble it all together. It's all of the above. It's all of the above. They connect all these different opinions together. And the good, what's the goodness? Well, it's days of Messiah, and there's the resurrection, and there's paradise, and there's material abundance in this world. That's the lay of the land, says the Rambam. And this is what all these people think in this most important question. What is the reward for righteousness? What is the punishment for wickedness? When righteousness and wickedness are defined as fulfilling, or God forbid, disobeying the will of God. However, this most wondrous point, meaning the Olam Haba, the world to come, that basically no one talks about. And it's very hard. It's vanishingly rare for a person, for people, to even consider it, or to talk about it, or to make it an important principle in their lives, or to try to figure out, is this the ultimate? Or something else may be the ultimate, and this is just a means? Is this a means, or is this an ends? That wondrous point, the world to come, it's not really part of this conversation. This big mumble jumble of discussion and opinions and cohorts about what the ultimate reward for righteousness is and the ultimate punishment for wickedness is. And instead, instead of people addressing this, they talk about all sorts of other ancillary and even silly things. They say, oh, when the righteous come back alive, will they be clothed or will they be naked? And if they're clothed, is it the same burial shrouds that they were buried in? Or maybe they'll just have just one simple garment that covers their body. Oh, Messiah comes. Will there be income inequality? There'll still be rich people and poor people, strong people or weak people, all sorts of silly ancillary questions. So this is the first part, the first introduction to the introduction of this chapter. There's a lot of confusion in this, and there's all sorts of opinions, and they talk about all sorts of things. They talk about purgatory versus paradise. They talk about resurrection versus eternal death. They talk about there's a Messiah versus missing out on that. They talk about abundance and security and wealth in this world versus poverty and pain in this world. And there's that fifth group that says we'll mix it all up together. But the idea of Olam Haba, no one talks about it. And instead, all the questions that people do address are all ancillary and they miss the point. So this is the first part of his introduction. A lot of confusion, a lot of different opinions, and everyone doesn't seem to have it all laid out clearly. What exactly are all these different things and how do they fit into the big picture of reward and punishment that is destined for the righteous and the wicked? That's the first introduction to the introduction. And then he says a second introduction. And this is more like zooming out even further. The whole question of what is the reward for righteousness and what is the punishment for wickedness, is this an appropriate line of inquiry? We're alive today, thank you, Almighty God, and we have choices, and we have free will, and we can choose righteousness or wickedness. And every day we can really make that choice. Should the reward destined for the righteous and the wicked destined for, and the punishment destined for the wicked, should that be a motivating factor or not? The next part of this magisterial essay addresses this question. Is it in fact appropriate to have something which is an ulterior motive for doing the will of God? And he starts off with a very interesting and almost humorous analogy. Imagine you have a young boy, and the father wants the boy to study Torah. Because after all, the best thing for the child is to study Torah. The best way for them to improve and to perfect themselves and refine themselves and upgrade themselves, the best thing for that is the study of Torah. But the kid is young, and the child's intellect is weak, and they don't understand the value and the imperative and the importance for Torah. So what do? You want to teach a child Torah? The kid doesn't want. They want to do other things. You bribe them. So you bring them to the tutor, to the teacher, and you say, come study a little bit. And if you study, I will give you nuts or dates or figs or a little bit of honey or a lollipop. So the kid says, oh, I want a lollipop. I'm going to study. Not because I want the Torah. Oh, no, definitely not. I don't want that. I don't even value it. Child doesn't value it. But I do want that exciting bit of sugar. And that's what they want. And that's what's valuable and important to them in their eyes. And if you had to ask them, what would you rather? A chapter of Torah, a piece of Mishnah, a citation from the Talmud, or the candy? No question. They want the candy. That's what they want. And therefore, you have to use that system. You got to bribe them. So the kid studies. But now they mature. They're not so into candy anymore. They're still not interested in studying for the sake of studying. But what motivated them previously no longer tickles their fancy. So instead, they come to the teacher and says, okay, I'll buy you some nice clothing. some fancy shoes, some cowboy boots. You'll study for that, right? Yeah, I want that. They'll study not because they want to study, because they want the reward. They want the bribe. They want the incentive. And then they mature a bit more. And the petty clothing and style, it doesn't even talk to them anymore. Now they want cold, hard cash. So they take the now more advanced young man and say, study this section or this chapter, and I will give you a dinar, which is a gold coin, or maybe two. And the kid's excited. I want the reward. And he wants to study, not because of the sake of studying, not because he values it, but because he wants the money. And the money is still more valuable than the study. He's willing to do it only because of the bribe. And then he gets even more mature. Even money doesn't talk to him. There's something even higher than that. Now he wants honor and prestige and respect. And you tell him, I want you to study. And when you study, you'll be a rabbi. You'll be a rabbinic judge. You'll sit in the front of the room. Everyone will stand up when you walk in. You'll give the famous lecture when everyone comes to hear what you have to say. You'll be the verified sage. You'll be like this and this great rabbi. And they study. Not because they want to study, but because they want the honor and respect and prestige and stature. We see someone who doesn't want to study, doesn't value it, but we're kind of escalating the rewards, the bribes, the incentives to persuade them to do it. Says the Rambam, all this is undesirous. This is not good. To just find some sort of bribe to get someone to study the Almighty's Torah. But people's intellect is weak. And therefore, you have to, if you want them to study at all, they need to be motivated from it. They need to say, choose wisdom, not for the sake of wisdom, but for something else, for the bribe. And the bribe changes, but the structure of what's happening here remains the same. And this is frivolity, says the Rambam. Ultimately, it's frivolity. And this, in the words of our sages, is called shelo lishma, not for its intended purpose. In the Talmud, in the literature, it talks about doing mitzvos, studying Torah, lishma, for its sake or for some other reason. Is it for the sake of the wisdom and the Torah and the righteousness and the goodness and the truth? Or is there something else? That something else could be the candy or the clothing or the dinars or the honor, something else that you are motivated for. Say reward, say afterlife, say Messiah, say resurrection. That too is a version of this, where you are studying not for the sake of studying, but the motivation is really something external. And then he cites all the sources, or many of the sources, that talk about the importance and the imperative of doing mitzvos and studying Torah for its sake. He quotes the Mishnah, Perkei Avos, chapter 4. Don't make Torah a crown to gain glory from. And don't make it a shovel to dig with. Don't say, oh, I have my agenda, all the things that I want, and I'm going to use the Torah as a means to get that. This, says the Rambam, refers to what I have explained to you. That you should not make the goal of wisdom, the goal of Torah study, something else, like honor, a crown to be glorified, or a shovel to dig with to make money. And you should not study Hashem's holy Torah to make a livelihood out of it. The goal of study should be the study. To know it. To know it and to perform it. And therefore, it is prohibited to say, when I do these mitzvos that you talk about, and I try to improve myself, and I try to avoid the transgressions and the prohibitions, what benefit will I get? What benefit will I garner? That's prohibited to say. Because you're exactly like the child who says, I don't want to study, give me the candy. So what he's in effect saying is that our whole subject is inappropriate. The whole discussion of what's the goal of mitzvos, what's the reward that we gain, and the punishment that we avoid by doing mitzvos, it's just another version of this child who wants the candy. We look at the child like, candy? Come on, you value that more than the Almighty's Torah? Yes, that's true. Not a question. And you know what? Even very mature adults who are having this conversation are doing another version of this. And then he quotes more sources. Our sages warned against this. The third Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Antigonus ish Soko, Antigonus, the man of Soko. He says, do not be like servants who serve the master with the intention of receiving reward. Instead, when you are a servant serving God, the master, you should do it with the intention of not receiving reward. Reward is not at all a motivation. So what is the motivation? I want to do truth because it's truth. I want to do truth for truth's sake. I want to serve God for the sake of serving God, for the privilege of serving God. And this is known, says the Rambam, as Oved Me'ahava, to serve God out of love. And cites more sources to this effect. The righteous one is one who desires God's mitzvos. He desires God's mitzvos and not the reward for God's mitzvos. Then he cites the Midrash. Suppose a person says, I'm going to study Torah so I will be rich, so I will be called rabbi. So I'll get reward in the afterlife. Suppose that would be okay. Talmud lower, the verse dispels that by saying, Le'ahava es Hashem elokach. You should do it for love of Hashem your God. Everything you do should be out of love, not out of some ulterior motivation. This matter is clear that the goal of Torah and the intention of our sages is to do this mitzvos for the mitzvos' sake, and only a fool who is unbalanced, who became corrupted and confused with foolish thoughts and bad ideas, only someone like that seeks to know what the external motivation for righteousness is. And then he tops it off by saying, this is what Abraham did. Abraham was very righteous and gave up everything for God. Why? Was he thinking about reward? No. Abraham served God out of love. And this is what we should do as well. This is where he's kind of saying that this whole discussion is really inappropriate. And if you stopped here, you'd be like, okay, we can't talk about this. Because he just laid out all the sources. It's not appropriate. It's like a child, like a petulant child. I don't want to study. Give me a candy. But, our sages understand if this is the level of Abraham, not every person is on that level. In fact, no one starts off on that level. And it's almost very rare to find someone who is mature and developed enough to understand that. Because our default setting is we don't do something, we don't kind of override our inertia only if we think that we'll gain something by doing that, or we'll avoid some pain by doing that. If we don't see any benefit of doing any action, then it's a waste of time, it's futility, it's emptiness. That's our default setting. And therefore, how can you tell a person, do the righteousness and don't do the wickedness, and don't do it out of any other motivation, not for fear of punishment, not to get reward? That's very hard. That's very, very hard. Because basically there's no one who understands truth on its own like Abraham did. So I'm saying that the whole discussion really ultimately is inappropriate, because really ultimately we should be like Abraham, doing it out of love, not because we want to get something out of it. But not everyone's Abraham. In fact, basically no one is. And therefore, it is permitted for the masses to have this conversation and to do mitzvos with anticipation of reward and to abstain from sin out of fear of punishment. And in fact, that's what we should do. We should encourage the masses to say, yes, you're right, you'll get reward for mitzvos. And you'll get punishment, God forbid, for transgressing the will of God. And the hope is that eventually, their intellect will grow and their appreciation for truth will expand. And just as we have a child and we try to ply them with bribes to get them to do what's right, because they're not smart enough, they're not intelligent enough, they're not developed enough to understand that this is better for them, this is beneficial for them, we do that with everyone. And in fact, the sages had a big problem with the teaching of Antigonus. Antigonus, man of Soko, you're saying be like servants who serve God without intention of receiving reward, in fact, with intention to not receive reward. You lionized the importance of altruism in your mitzvos. You actually made a mistake because you taught that publicly. And the public should not be motivated or should not be encouraged to seek altruism and to do it truth for the truth's sake. It's the ideal, it's true, but you have to be very careful. You have to know your audience. And basically no one is able to hear that. And if the masses, if they say we're going to do mitzvahs because we want reward, and we're going to avoid transgressing the will of Hashem because we want to avoid punishment, the loss is not that great. They're not perfect. Because perfection demands altruism. It's not perfect, but it's very, very good for them to hopefully grow in their understanding and their wisdom. And eventually they'll arrive at this understanding and this appreciation and this truth that serving God out of love, that's the ultimate value. And he cites the famous teaching in the Talmud, found in many places in the Talmud, La'olam, forever, a person should engage in Torah study and mitzvos, afilu shelo lishma, even if it's not for its intended purpose. Why? Shemetoch shelo lishma balishma. Because through a person doing mitzvos without the correct motivation, meaning for the incorrect motivation, thinking about the reward that they'll garner, that is the portal, that's the pathway to achieve ultimately the ultimate goal of lishma, of doing it out of love for the correct intended purpose, as outlined by Antigonus, man of Soko. So we have the second part of the introduction. First part is lots of confusion. Everyone who talks about this seems to say something else, and everyone seems to be proofs to what they're saying. And there's so much confusion and obfuscation about this important question, what's the reward? The second part of the introduction is, well, it's really an inappropriate pursuit. Because ultimately, we should not be doing mitzvos because of any motivation of reward. We should do the truth because it is true. Lishma, serve God out of love. But it's too much to ask for the masses, and therefore our conversation, our analysis, our exploration is, in fact, appropriate. That's the second introduction. And here's the third. This is the third introduction, which is the prerequisite for having this conversation. So first he starts off with, why do we need a conversation? No one knows the answer. Everyone's confused. Everyone seems to say something, and some just big mumbo jumbo of it all together, and no one seems to know with clarity what is the ultimate reward for righteousness. That's why we have to have a conversation. It's not well known, and there's so much confusion. Is it appropriate? That's the second part of the introduction. Well, really, it's not appropriate, but this is what we have to do, because only through a path of shelo lishma, of doing the study of what we actually gain from righteousness, only through that can we arrive at the true highest value, which is to do the truth for truth's sake. And the third introduction is going to be the prerequisites. What operating assumptions must we have in order to have this study? Very important. How do we understand the words of our sages? When our sages say things that are most mysterious and seem to be in violation of the rules of nature, the rules of physics, what to do? And there's all sorts of different opinions, 3 different opinions as to how to understand the words of our sages. The first group, and this is maybe the majority, and these are people who are writing books and giving lectures, and they're interpreting the words of our sages. And they understand everything as being literal. There's no subtlety. They don't understand that there's nuance and layers and subtlety in the words of our sages. And therefore, they take it all literally. And things that are described in the words of the sages that are impossible, that violate all the rules that we know of in nature, well, they're mandatory. They have to happen. So there's a mismatch. There's an asymmetry between the rules of nature and the things that we understand as being true versus not true, and the words of the sages. What do you do then? So this first cohort, they say, well, it must be that this is what our sages say, so we have to just read it and understand it simply. And people who have that very narrow aperture, narrow focus of what is the possible interpretation of the words of our sages, they only do that because they don't understand wisdom, and they're distant from insight, and they don't have perfection to understand the concept of a much more advanced sage. And there's no one who's going to encourage them to realize this. And therefore, when they read the words of the sages, and the sages say things that don't seem to make sense to their small, puny brain, how do they reconcile that? They'll say, well, this is the only possible explanation I understand, so must be what they intended. They kind of assigned their limited capacity. The sages must have had the same limited capacity. So I'm reading their words, and this is the only way I can interpret it. Well, that must be their intention as well. And even things that if you read it and you understand it only simply, without any subtlety and nuance, it's things that are very distant from intellect, and things that are slanderous even. Things that if a human, ordinary, regular, simpleton author were to say, it would be baffling that anyone could have that opinion. Certainly not a sage. And how could it be that anyone would say such a thing? That's what we would say if we read it from a regular, ordinary author. And we certainly wouldn't embrace it. We wouldn't think this is a great idea. These people, this first cohort, due to their foolishness in assigning to the sages the same degree of intellect that they have, in fact, they are berating and ridiculing and lowering the stature of the sages. Now, they don't realize it. These are people that maybe they're well-meaning. They want to do what's right. They want to follow the words of the sages, but they read it and they understand it simply, literally, without any deeper nuance. But in fact, it's a great disgrace to the sages. And it's quite unfortunate that this group, they lessen the stature of Torah, and they dampen the glory and the brilliance of Torah. And they take the word of Hashem and they flip it upside down. In the Torah, it says that when Torah itself is proclaimed, anyone who hears it will be so wowed by it and will say only a great and wise nation can possibly have such wonderful Torah. But when these guys start to speak about Torah, they say, well, this is what it says. This is what it must mean, right? In fact, they are disgracing the words of Torah. And they're disgracing the great nation, the glorious nation that harbors the Torah. And this is what he says. Most of the people who speak, the lecturers, the orators, when they speak to crowds, this is their bread and butter. Well, this is what it says. This is what it must mean. And if only these people would keep quiet. It would be so much better if they would just sit down and close their mouth and not disgrace the words of Torah. Or if they would say, we don't understand it. We don't understand it. That's a fair statement to say. This is what it says. It cannot be simply understood what exactly it means. What were the sages actually referring to? I don't know. I'm not intelligent enough. I'm not clever enough to know. That's a fair statement. But to say that I do understand everything that the sages had possibly intended, and this is what it is, and it makes no sense, You are disgracing the words of Torah. This is the first cohort. If you want to understand the Rambam, what he's talking about, and you're part of this cohort, stop now, turn off the tape, leave, go find something else to do, go play tennis or pickleball. This is not going to be valuable for you. First cohort, not welcome. The second cohort. And there's a lot of people in this second cohort as well. And they're very similar to the first cohort because they also interpret the words of the sages only simply, what does it say? Let's interpret it literally. And they don't ascribe any nuance or subtlety to the words of the sages. But instead of saying, well, this is what our sages say and this is what we accept, it makes no sense, but we accept it anyhow. They say, well, it makes no sense. This is what it says, and there's no other alternative or subtler meaning in it, but it's obviously ridiculous and absurd. And they demean it, and they ridicule it, and they slander the sages baselessly. And they indicate that these simpletons, these lay people, these riffraff, people of weak, pitiful intelligence, foolish in every possible way, this is the words of the Rambam, they don't understand any bit of wisdom. And they don't understand the subtlety. But they're evil, and they're accursed. They're assigning to the great words of the sages the interpretation that sages never had. And it is, on its face, patently absurd if you don't understand the nuance and the method of how the sages actually tried to communicate. And this group is cursed. They're foolish and they're cursed. And had they known exactly how to understand the words of the sages and how to present it and how to organize it, then they would be able to differentiate between the real sages and the fake ones. And the deep penetrating insight of the sages would come into clear view. This second accursed cohort is also not welcome to discussions to ensue. And then there's the third cohort, and it's so small. You can't even call it a cohort. Imagine there's only one of a certain thing. It's not a group. It's not a species. It's only one. It's basically that like that. You can't call it a cohort. Cohort's got to be like a bunch of people or a certain percentage. If it's like 1%, 1%, it's negligible. This cohort gets it. They understand that our sages had enormous intellect and enormous insight and understanding. And they had a perception of truth that is unfathomable. And therefore, when they encounter teachings of the sages that seem to not really fit literally or simply, they understand that there's subtlety and there's nuance and there's the revealed message and then there's the hidden message. It's encrypted. It's a cipher. It's a riddle. It's a parable. It's an analogy. There's something revealed, but there's something which is hidden. And this is why the great book of Proverbs starts off by saying, to understand a mashal, a parable, a melitza, another word for like an enigma, a riddle. That is the words of our sages. And he cites maybe the best example of this. We see the wisest of all men. He did this with prophecy, meaning Solomon, the book of Proverbs, the book of Song of Songs, the book of Ecclesiastes. He wrote all these books that are clearly all pregnant with subtlety and nuance. And he cites some examples to this effect. Those, for example, that Ezekiel revived, where our sages themselves say that it's an insight, it's an analogy, it's a mashal, it's a parable, The whole book of Job, or at least partially, is an analogy and so on. The third group gets it. They understand the words of our sages. Suppose they have way, way, way more intellect than you. And they very clearly understand on a much deeper level than you. And this is what they write. So if you say, this, my limited understanding, this is their limited understanding as well, well, then you have only two choices. Either this is literally true, and literally as I understand it, with my own limitations, this is what it is, and I believe it, and I don't understand it, but I have to just say this is what they meant. Or I say this is what they meant, and it's ridiculous, and I ridicule it, and that's the accursed group. The third group. You can't even call it a group. Most people are not humble enough to be part of this group. To say, whoa, we're dealing with some of the most talented people who have ever lived, and are writing in a way where there's the kind of the public-facing part of it, the revealed part of it, and there's all sorts of layers upon layers upon layers of subtlety that are hidden. This cohort is the only one that's welcomed in our exploration. I'll read you the words of the Rambam. V'ata, v'im ata, and if you are one of the first two groups, don't listen to me. Don't pursue anything in this study. You're not going to benefit from this study. Actually, it will harm you, and you'll hate it. So don't go further. He gives the example. If someone is accustomed to a bad diet, and you start giving them vegetables or healthy food, it's like, oh, it gives them a stomachache, right? It gives them a stomachache. Why? Because they're so conditioned to junk. If you're conditioned to intellectual junk, you're about to hear something which is wholesome, which is true, which is healthful, but it'll damage you and you'll hate it. But if you are part of this third cohort and you encounter something that healthy intellect rejects, you have to understand, this is a chida, this is a riddle, this is a parable. And then you will try to figure out what possibly may be the intention. What could possibly be the deeper meaning? If you're that kind of person, then proceed in my work, and it will be beneficial to you with the help of the Almighty. So let's review. Rambam is talking about a very important subject: reward and punishment for righteousness and wickedness. This is the most authoritative source on this question. This is it. This is the most famous essay on this subject. And he starts by saying people don't know. There's confusion. There's uncertainty. It's a big mishmash. There's 5 different opinions as to what exactly is the reward for righteousness and the punishment for wickedness. And then he zooms out and says, wait a minute, is this discussion even appropriate? Ideally, we should do the truth for truth's sake. Yes, that's true. However, we're not there. Most people are not on the level of Abraham to be able to say, I want to do out of love. No, we have to be motivated, and we have to know what's in it for us. We're just a more advanced child who wants a lollipop. Our lollipop is a little bit different shaped. And finally, the prerequisite is to understand the words of our sages were written by people vastly more talented and gifted than us. Vastly. And they had a sense of knowledge and understanding and insight that absolutely dwarfs our understanding. And therefore, when we encounter their teachings, we have to understand there's something way more advanced. I got to work really, really hard to try to get more of a glimpse into the true intention of the sages. If you have that prerequisite, then you may proceed. With those 3 introductions, the Rambam says, okay, now you're ready. Now you're ready, and now I will begin to tell you what my intention truly is, what the plan really is in this discussion. And he proceeds, and it's absolutely glorious, where he talks about Olam Haba, and he fits in all those other things, Messiah and resurrection and all that, heaven and hell. He puts it all into the right place and lays out for us the true understanding of what the ultimate motivation for mitzvos are. the ultimate benefit that we garner via the performance of the mitzvos, what is our goal, what is facilitatory, which just facilitates the goal, but it's not the ultimate goal. He lays it out for us, and we'll do that, please God, next time. But again, we're trying to study some of the great and famous citations and teachings, essays, treatises of the foundations of our philosophy. And right now we're reading the Rambam's, Maimonides' introduction to his commentary to Mishnah on the end of the book of Sanhedrin. And we're about maybe halfway, maybe not quite halfway through his introduction. We have the introductions of the introduction. And that time, please God, we will see the actual content of his message. What is the ultimate goal, the ultimate reward that is destined for those who are righteous? Please God, we'll continue that in our next session. I'd like to hear your questions, your comments, and your feedback. And if you want to email me, you can do so at my email address, which is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. I'm in the Torch Center here in Houston, Texas. And you are wherever you are. If you're here, that's great. If you're there, that's also great. You can reach me via that aforementioned email, rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.